Let's get rolling. So, thanks everybody for joining in. Um, we're so grateful to have Dan Skinner join us. Now, Dan and his partner did a session with us quite some time ago on, I think, injury prevention and just some sort of stuff you can do to, prevent maybe injuries, of all capacities, like overuse stuff. And anyway, today what Dan's going to jump in on is strength training for endurance athletes, or probably athletes in general. Now, Dan, if you don't know his spec sheet, he's well, I don't know. You're like a mover and shaker in this community, that's for sure. He's highly credentialed. He's incredible strength and conditioning coach. Um, Check out his Instagram feed because he does some like ridiculous stuff with kettlebells. I saw you do one recently where you threw a kettlebell up in the air, and it was just actually quite terrifying to watch. But also physio, yep, and
I'm a chiropractor.
oh, chiropractor. I'm sorry. Yeah,
It's okay. Hey,
same thing.
very close. Nowadays, it's funny. Nowadays, it's like all the good chiros are practicing like physios, and physios are like it's a collision course. So yeah, it happens all the time. Get
Yeah,
confused.
I do know the difference. I apologize.
We're just trained for about an extra 2 years is all.
Oh, ooh. Anyway, Dan, it's so great to have you on. Thank you for giving us some of your time here. And I know people are excited to hear you talk, so I'm going to shut up and let you get cracking here.
Yeah, thanks, Jasper. This was I guess the first time me and Alex got to come on. Was we had such a fun time afterwards. We were talking for hours afterwards, like, oh yeah, we should have mentioned this, we should have said this, we should have said that. And it's always fun to come on and share what information we've kind of accumulated in our athletic career or in our in our jobs, and pass it along to people. And hopefully you guys can learn from some of the mistakes that I've made in my strength training career. And I'll kind of just start by telling you just a little bit more of the details of where my sport background was like. So I started for 15 years. I was a competitive cyclist. I was a mountain biker to start off with, and then I switched over to road cycling and moved out to Victoria, where I trained with the National Center. Had some amazing teammates and coaches that have gone on to do much better things in sport than I ever did. I was kind of one of those people that I worked really hard. I feel like I tapped into my talent as best as I could, got to a reasonably high level, and then just kind of came to terms with the fact that like everybody else seems to be doing just a little bit better than me. So I was very it was a very easy transition for me to come out of sports and performance side and get more into the health and wellness side, which is kind of what I do now for work. So as a chiropractor, my job is to really help people move and feel better in their bodies and help them reconnect with their bodies a little bit better. And often what happens is, even whether we're sitting at a desk or whether we're riding our bike for a living, we tend to lose track and we lose connection with certain parts of our body and certain parts of our physiology in some ways. And so I feel like for me, the reason why I'm so passionate about strength training is because it's been so instrumental in not only keeping me healthy and safe as an athlete, but it's also something that I look at as very scalable in what I do as a chiropractor as well. So I think the main reasons why we want to look at why strength and conditioning is such a helpful tool is because it's actually it's very fitting for a lot of goals that people want. And so I always think that when it comes to using any tool, we need to look at what our goals are. So most importantly, I think when it comes to sports and when it comes to any kind of athletic pursuits, we want to look at things as like, what can we do to maintain our ability to do our sport or do our athletics or do our competitions as long as we can? Because the best thing that we can do is we can have a long lasting career or a long lasting period of time where we're actually enjoying our sport or our competitions. And then we also, of course, want to use strength and conditioning as a way to increase and boost our performance. So I always look at things as like, it's longevity and it's sports performance. Those are the big things when it comes to athletics. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of other reasons why we'd want to do it just as a general population, right? Like the whole reason why we even invented exercise in the first place is because if we were to just not do anything and just do our jobs, we're so sedentary that we would be taken down by things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, right? We wouldn't be able to walk up a flight of stairs because now we have elevators that do all that for us. So we really use sports and strength and conditioning as a way to like reconnect with our bodies the way they were designed to be used, which is we adapt to stress. So if we think about that, strength and conditioning is our way of pushing into that kind of healthy stress that's going to build up our bodies, make us better athletes, let us sit on our computers longer, let us do all the stuff that we want to do without aches and pains, and having a higher capacity than we would if we didn't do that kind of stuff. Does that make sense so far? Everyone with me?
Definitely. Yep.
Cool. And then before I get too deep into it, do we have any questions? Are there any specific things that people want me to talk about, or before I start to just like go off into my kind of pre-planned stuff that I was going to talk about? That I just want to make sure, because if there's something that I can touch on while I'm going through and it's going to be more helpful for you guys, I'd much rather do that.
Yeah, I think definitely I would encourage people either in the chat box, like if they're a little shy to sort of, jump in there, feel free to type something in the chat box if you want, or you can use the raise your hand function and I can just, I have no problem cutting Dan off.
Yeah, oh yeah, you can cut me off anytime you want.
If you're a bit shy, you can just type it in if you want, and I can pose the question to him. But yeah, anybody got anything initial, or do you want to why don't you just dive right in and then we'll field stuff if it comes?
Sure, that sounds good. So let's talk about, well, first of all, the big thing that I was hoping that I could pass on for all of you guys is I think that there are so many myths when it comes to strength and conditioning and weightlifting and quote unquote working out. That's probably the biggest thing that I want to be passing on to you guys today is like, there's so many misconceptions, and maybe what I'll do is I'll like debunk a few of those for you guys today. And then I also want to quickly tell you how it is that those two different like those that sports performance and then that health and longevity kind of avenues, how they kind of are played at best. So let me just kind of go right into it. When it comes to strength and conditioning, and I use that term as like a broad umbrella term for that can be weightlifting, that can be plyometrics, that can be body weight, that can be all kinds of different things. And what we're thinking about is we're focusing on the strength side of things. And so if you were to break things down, and a marathon is over here, which is going to be endurance activity. You're doing the same repetitive movement over and over and over. You're going to do it a whole bunch of times. So that's going to be high repetition and relatively like low max output. So if the most amount that you could sprint would be 40 meter sprint, that's going to be more on like that strength and power side. And then a marathon is going to be over here. And so a lot of us, when we're doing triathlon or if we're doing endurance activities, we're going to be kind of closer over to this side of the spectrum, right? However, that doesn't mean that we don't need to also be training in this higher level. And it's actually kind of the low-hanging fruit for a lot of people, because a lot of the time we train the way that we race. And like you guys are super fortunate because you have Jasper as like an amazing resource for when it comes to the the skill and the training behind the events that you're doing. So for swimming, biking, running, and all that stuff, like having a good coach, hands down, the most important thing that you could possibly do if you're thinking about pursuing new sports or even sports you're already really good at. It's just really great to have like an eye on all of those little moving pieces. It's really cool for us to focus on our strengths, but a good coach will actually start to pick out your weaknesses and start to make you work a little bit more in through there. And so I think that that's like, first of all, having a coach that's looking at all these different things for you is just such a huge advantage for people. A critical eye is amazing. And now if we think about that spectrum and we're doing lots of our work over here, and we're doing very little of that work over here on this side, where we're thinking with a little bit more explosive movements, or maybe movements where we're adding weight and resistance, we're going to have very different physical adaptations. So over here, if I'm doing a lot of repetitive work, I'm going to have things that are going to start to change in my body. Like, for instance, the capillaries in around my muscles and around my tissue start to densify. They start to get bigger. We get better at the stuff that we're doing, which is we're offloading oxygen into our tissues, because when we do long-term exercise, we need more of that oxygen resource. We call it aerobic versus anaerobic. So aerobic is going to be when we use oxygen. That's a primary source, and that's going to help us burn fat and stuff. I know it sounds like I'm throwing out a lot of terms here, but it'll make more sense when I start to like make it a little more simple here. So think of this as the stress that we give is the way that we change our body. So if I'm huffing and puffing a whole bunch, I'm going to get better and better at huffing and puffing in a lot of ways. And if I'm running for a longer period of time, I'm going to eventually get better at running for a long period of time. Now, on the other side, on the flip side, if I want to do some strength adaptation, which is going to mean it's going to take basically my ceiling, my max effort. So if right over here, if my running is, if I'm only at 5 or 10% of what my max sprint would be, and I do some things over here to bring that max up, well, then naturally, that's going to actually bring the whole ceiling up for the rest of my activities. So now that 5% might actually be what my old 6 or 7% was. So I think a lot of people spend so much time working on the endurance side that they actually neglect this really great way of boosting our ceiling naturally. So when we do strength training, when we put weights on our put weights into our programs, we're creating very specific adaptations in the muscles and then also neurologically. So some of those adaptations are going to be things like our ability to recruit bigger and more motor units. And what a motor unit is it's that communication system between the mind and the body. A motor unit is my mind telling my body and my muscle, we need you to contract more of these fibers so that you can get more strength. We actually have a really cool way, like I look at it as like this. You don't have to have the biggest muscles to be really strong. You just have to have a really well-tuned nervous system. And so if your body can communicate really well and it can kind of tell you what your needs are quickly, you can actually get a lot more out of those contractions. And I know that there's a lot of different stuff that goes on there. I'm trying to just condense it so that it seems like a little more understandable. You guys kind of understanding and following with me so far? Cool. Without taking you through like a full lecture in physiology. So those are some of the big things that you get out of that. The sports performance side, it's amazing to be able to, like, if you can run all day, that's great. But if you can run and you can sprint, that just opens up so many more possibilities when you're racing and training. You never know what your races are going to end up with. Like, you could end up in a group with 10, 15 people at the finish and you've got to out sprint them. That would be pretty cool, right? You go from being an endurance athlete to all of a sudden, in the flash of an eye, you turn into a sprinter. One of the big misconceptions around that, though, is that if you strength train, you're going to start to add a lot of extra muscle to your body. And that's like, just, it's not true, because some really strong athletes are actually very lean and they don't have a lot of muscle mass. And like I was telling you, it's all about creating that neurological connection. One of the biggest problems I think that we have, especially, I mean, let's not even talk about sport. Let's just kind of like talk about people in general, right? A lot of people will say things like, oh, I don't want to strength train because I'm going to get too bulky. I don't want to strength train because it's going to make me heavier. I won't fit my clothes or whatever it is. And remember, strength training is an adaptation that we're giving our body. We're trying to force, give ourselves a little bit of a challenge in some way, and our body adapts to it. There are so many things that go into making a person bulky. One of those things is going to be your diet. And so if you're already doing a lot of endurance activities, your diet is probably already spoken for in a lot of ways, right? In order for you to start to put on muscle, you actually have to have a significant calorie surplus. So you can do all the strength training you want. You can go and, lift all the weights, but if you're not giving yourself the adequate extra calories, then you, unfortunately or fortunately, you're going to be a little bit less on the bulk side, but you will still get a lot of those strength benefits, because like I was saying, real strength comes from that connection of the nervous system. And then eventually we start to add, we get to a point where more muscle can be more helpful. So that's when the conversation starts to shift more towards, well, is this athlete going to do better having a little extra muscle on them, or is this athlete going to do just fine keeping their strength gains as high as they can and managing their diet so that they're not putting on that excessive weight? So like for me, when I was a road cyclist, I was so lucky to have some amazing strength and conditioning coaches help me. And what we found was, like, I was still like, I'm significantly heavier than I was when I raced. I was like anywhere between 165 to 170 pounds, and I'm 6'3" and a bit. So still quite thin, probably like unhealthily thin at that point. But it was still, it was great for me because I could get all of the benefits from that strength side. And at the same time, like my body weight was still quite low for my height. So that's probably one of the big things that people think of when they think of strength training. They're like, oh, well, like if I train more with weights, I'm going to end up getting bulkier. And I'm just trying to tell you that's not true. The other really good benefit to making sure that you do a little bit of strength training, again, whether it's weights or plyometrics or something, is the effect that it has on our connective tissue and the way that it keeps us healthy. So I can't even count the amount of times that, like, I've been practicing in Victoria for about 6 years, and the amount of times where people have come in with like an overuse injury in like a knee tendon or an elbow tendon or a shoulder or something like that. And often what happens is we're getting so repetitive in the movements that we're doing that we're starting to kind of cause more stress and strain into those tendons. And I think of strength training as an opportunity to keep your body a little bit, think of it as a little bit more holistic type work. So you're creating less imbalances by doing the same thing over and over and over again, putting less of that, 100% of that effort might not be going into the front of your shoulder anymore. Now it's going through your entire shoulder. We're balancing things out a little bit. And then also just making sure that when we're in our off season, or when we're even in the middle of our season for that matter, we're doing certain movements and we're doing certain stressors to make sure that that tension is being evenly distributed throughout parts of our body, through not just the outside of our knee and not just the front side of our knee. And it's a really great way to kind of like keep off the injury boogeyman, so to speak. We kind of prevent a little bit of injury by giving ourselves a little bit more of a general stress. Cycling or swimming or running is very specific, right? And it's one of the cool opportunities that we have where we can actually be really general. So I'm going to generally strengthen up my leg, my core, and my chest, and my upper back, and everything like that, so that I can be specific in the activities and exercises that I'm doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I was just gonna say, like, yeah, just to kind of highlight a couple things you've said. For endurance sports specifically, that is one of the major concerns that we encounter is people don't want to put on bulk, right? Because if you're going to do a marathon or an Ironman, you don't want to be carrying an extra 10 pounds, because that's like a lot of extra weight to carry from start to finish. And what I always try and tell them is, no, the goal with strength training for this is recruitment. It's like, and in very simple terms, I say, if you have 100 muscle fibers in your leg and you're currently using 30 of them, the goal with strength training is to get to use 50 of them. Now that might be a really, dumbed down way of explaining it, but that's kind of what I sort of try and tell people is, like, we're not trying to make you into the Hulk. We're trying to get you to utilize more of what you already have.
That's a great explanation.
Fair?
I feel like that's a really, really good way of communicating that, because it really is like, I mean, the cool thing is, and I find that this is maybe the cool little take home for me too, is like, when we're talking about motor recruitment, like, have you ever heard of these like crazy feats of strength where a person like has to lift a bus off of like a baby carriage or something like that? So our nervous system, its number one priority is to take care of us, right? And it knows it's always doing calculations to see just how close we are to injury, right? And the unfortunate thing is, the more trained we get, the more we can start to push our bodies, so we can push ourselves to like these new heights, which is good, but it can also be a bad thing for us. So anyway, when these people have these amazing feats of strength, they've figured out some kind of way of overriding their nervous system, and they're pulling with so much force that could rupture a tendon in their arm, or it could peel their bicep right off of the bone, right? Our body is always making sure that it's kind of the brake for us. It's like throwing these breaker switches. And what strength training is it's the way that our nervous system grants us more strength, if that makes sense. So it's not a product of the muscles being big. Like, we actually have a ton more strength in our bodies than we could ever imagine we do. But when we teach ourselves that, hey, actually, it's not so bad, and we condition our tendons and tissue, oh, that's not so bad, we can do a little bit more, we're convincing our body to release more of that strength, that inborn strength that we have. So motor recruitment is one good theory behind that too. And like, I think that's a really, really good way to put it. So thanks for like explaining that a little bit more there, Jasper. Did that make sense for everybody? Cool. So it's not this big scary thing that people think where as soon as you start to pick up one weight. In fact, it's really funny because if you talk to people who are like strength athletes they're intentionally trying to gain weight, there's like, this is hard. I have to eat so much food, or like I have to, I have to cut my training down quite a bit. That's another thing I want to talk about really quickly too is um, the way that we have been kind of taught, or the way that like strength training has been passed down over generations, like it's something that's been happening for years and years and years. Like even like the Romans would, throw discuses and things like those are resistance objects, right? Like they would pick up, they would strength train like all the way back in the times probably when they were writing on caves and hieroglyphics and things. But over the last little bit, we have this uh, we've got this belief that modern strength training is basically the same as bodybuilding, which is 3 sets of 10 for all of these exercises. We really think of it more like we're going to take some other way, or basically in a lot of ways you could say it like another sport. So bodybuilding in its own way is a sport. We're going to take that sport and we're just going to add it to our sport, when really it's kind of a funny way to do that. If we're looking at truly getting the goals out of what we want for strength training, we have to look a little bit closer at how we set up our sets and our reps and our rest, and really like what the goals are. Because if my goals are to get more motor recruitment, I actually want to do less reps. I might not want to do 30 reps. 30 reps could fatigue me and make my nervous system a little bit more tired. And I always think that if you treat a gym workout like an endurance workout, where at the end of it you're huffing and puffing, you're kind of missing the point. Because I think a lot of philosophy around strength training gets muddled into like the CrossFit side of things, or like the high intensity intervals side of things. And really those are just their own standalone things. So again, instead of taking a sport and plugging it into something we're doing and calling it extra and calling it strength training, we should actually look at what it is that we're programming and see if it meets our goals. So I'll give you an example. Okay. Um, if you're a triathlete and you're going to do a workout in the gym, you're going to do 3 exercises. You're going to do a squat, you're going to do a row, and you're going to do some lunges. So when we're talking about those motor units and that recruitment, if I give that person 2 completely different workouts, one is going to be 5 sets of 5, and the other one is going to be 3 sets of 10. So if I give them 3 sets of 10, then they're going to have to choose their weight so that they can complete exactly 10 reps or close to it, right? That's going to be 30 reps altogether. But 5 sets of 5 is going to be 25, right? So I'm doing 5 less reps. Now, if you were to look at how I structure the amount of reps I'm doing, for only 5, I can significantly increase the amount of weight that I'm going to be putting through that muscle. So that's going to be creating a higher level of motor recruitment, right? Just like Jasper was talking about, if I have a challenge that my body has to meet, I'm going to have to look at my resources. And if my body doesn't have enough, it's going to turn on more of these receptors that are going to give me more recruitment into my body. So again, if I'm only using 10% of my motor units when I'm doing 10 reps, now maybe I'm going to be using 20 or 30 or more, right? And I'm just throwing out numbers just to kind of have you guys get the point a little bit here. But what I'm saying is that if I keep the rep scale a little bit lower and give myself a little bit more rest, I'm actually going to be able to get higher strength yields out of that. And that's a little different than strength endurance. So again, like think of it on the spectrum here. If I'm doing 10 reps over here and I'm doing 1 rep over here, the more we want to train raw strength, or like the motor recruitment side of things, the closer we're going to be over to this side. If we're looking for more strength endurance, we're going to be over here. And it's just like any other sport. There's a time and place for all of this stuff. So when I'm first getting a person to dip their toes into strength training, I'm going to spend a little bit more time closer to this end of the spectrum, which is going to be sets of exercises where they're doing 8 to 10 reps. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first thing is I want to make sure that they're doing the exercises safely. And so if I'm giving them 30 reps, if I'm doing 3 sets of 10, that's 5 extra reps that they can practice with good form and really kind of get that connection working, right? I don't want to take a person who's brand new to the gym and just throw them in there and give them like 5 sets of 5. And they're going to be, first of all, they'll be so sore. And they'll also potentially have problems with a few of those reps as it gets heavier. The heavier the weight, we know a little bit of that risk goes up. So anytime a person is just new to strength training, we usually break it down. And I would probably say even more like, I won't just give them 10 right away. I might give them a whole bunch of little sets of 5 so they can do perfect practice of all those different 5. One of the big reasons why, so I opened up a gym in the early beginning of the year with a couple other partners, and it's called Third Space Movement. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this was we wanted to create like purposeful strength training for people. So people were understanding that there's actually like an intention behind it. We're not just going into the gym and trying to get you exhausted, right? Because a lot of people confuse strength training with just exhaustion training. And it's funny because like if you train yourself to fail all the time, you're going to fail. But if you train yourself for success, you're going to succeed. So a lot of it, again, comes back down to those goals that we're looking for. So any questions so far? I feel like I've said a lot of words.
No, this is great so far. I think the space of strength training for a lot of people can be quite overwhelming, and you've kind of touched on a few reasons why. And I think that's because we have this image of strength training as being like, okay, that's bodybuilding, which it's not. Then they've heard the word functional strength training, which I was going to ask you about in a bit. Like, what does that mean to you? Then there's things like CrossFit. And then there's like, the whole sets and reps things can really throw people for a loop. But what I'm hearing from you is that it's actually quite simple, and that, we want to maybe use slightly higher reps with lower weight to get technically really proficient at something. And then we actually move to, by and large, for most people, we move to, fewer reps, maybe a few more sets with a little bit more load when they can do it technically well. And it's pretty simple.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think, and functional strength training, I think is kind of hilarious because like strength training should be functional. Like
Right.
by definition, function
Well,
is that there's a goal outcome, right?
What does functional strength training mean to you? Like if you were to use that, you sort of laughed at it, but what, that's a sort of a buzzword. And I think people are like, oh, functional. I don't think they really know what that is supposed to mean. What does that
Yeah, I
mean to
think
you?
it's very much a buzzword, right? I think people put it, it's a great, it's a great word to use because it's slightly confusing, but it sounds good. It sounds like what you need,
Right.
right? Like, oh, well, would you want strength training or would you want functional strength training? Like, oh yeah, that one sounds good to me. I think it's like functional fitness really, to go back into where it probably originally came from. Like, so CrossFit was the original like functional fitness training, right? And people have since, it's almost like tissue paper and Kleenex. It's like if you're doing a functional training workout, it's basically like slang for a CrossFit workout. Which I don't think that there's anything wrong with doing that if that's your goal. If your goal is to, and if that's what you kind of want, I guess sometimes it's like, it's figuring out like, is that actually a useful tool, right? I could take a screwdriver, turn it on its side, and hammer a nail in, but it's not going to really do as good of a job as if I picked up a hammer and gave it a couple swings and got the job done, right? So functional training for me is training with a purpose. So you can paint that all over any canvas you want. Like functional training is probably the programs that you're providing for people, right? There's a well thought out goal behind it, but it is very buzzwordy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, and I think probably the way that it's most used is a way of basically talking about exercises that are deemed for whatever reason, like deemed to be more functional. Um, like, so for instance, if you're doing like barbell lifts are actually not super functional. Like it's funny because like, when was the last time you had to pick something up off the ground and it was even on both sides and the handle was perfectly symmetrical and the weight was balanced perfectly? Like like if you were to really break it down, real functional training would be something like, okay, you've got a baby under one arm, and then on the other side, your corgi is pulling on a leash, and now you need to do like a split squat, and the whole time you're talking on the phone. Like that would be way more close to real functional training, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just kind of, I think the functional training buzzword has kind of just gotten out of control. Anyway,
So
not to like,
maybe the way to look at it then is like, again, if we go back to the idea that, in a lot of people's minds, especially if you're of a certain age group, which is older, like when we think of strength training, we think of bodybuilding. And the goal for bodybuilding was simply just to get big and look a certain way. And
absolutely.
and to move like a lot of weight in a very specific way. Just as you said, balanced on both sides with a nice bar in a gym. This was the goal. But
Totally.
if I love again that we have a figure skater on here because they're like in triathlon or endurance sports, very linear. And part of our challenge, yes, we want to encourage recruitment. We want people to get stronger so they can maybe push more wattage on the bike, for example. We want that. We also want injury prevention. It's so linear that we need to kind of move people out of that a little bit to strengthen other ways so they don't get injured. But when I think of a sport like figure skating, it's exactly like that. It's that, I've got a baby under one arm and a corgi pulling me this way. I mean, figure skating, there's so much going on. They're spinning, they're jumping, they're having to sort of like manage themselves in a whole bunch of different ways with a leg up here and an arm over here. And, and they're on a very thin blade. So I don't want to use the word functional training, but like, I think the model of like traditional lifting is still useful. Explosive power is very useful, but also what's very useful for them is getting them strong in a way that like maybe you're putting them on like a half Bosu ball and challenging them in different ways there, so they actually get like all the fine little muscles that keep them in balance is good. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Maybe
Oh
you know.
yeah, man. There's so many different ways. For a while, well, so this is, I always look at it like this: an athlete only has so much time to train. So, and there's no replacing the rink or the ice or the dance floor or whatever it is. Like if they're a professional dancer or an ice skater or a triathlete, there is no replicating exactly what their playing surface or competition surface is going to be like in the gym.
Mhm.
And we like in the gym, we're actually going for general adaptation. Like like as much as we try and be super ultra sports specific, like for instance, I think we actually get caught down that wormhole a little too much. I remember when I was bike racing, one of my early coaches was like, had all of us, and this is again years ago, right? So like no fault to this guy because sports specificity was king back then. So they had us narrow our squat stance, feet perfectly straight, replicating what it was like standing over top of our pedals, right? Which
Yeah.
now we realize is definitely not the way to do it because everyone's hip anatomy, knee anatomy, torso to leg length is different. Everybody's squat stance has to be different. So would I take a figure skater and have them do a traditional back squat? Maybe, yeah, I could do that if I'm looking for general strength. But where they're going to get a lot of that really specific strength can be through a very specific exercise. So like that would be like down that level of functional training. So again, functional is defined by what the outcome is. Like the function for a figure skater could be very different than the function for a shot putter or a triathlete. So there's lots of like, I guess the big thing is we don't want to get too far down that sports specificity rabbit hole because then we don't have any time left to train general. And general is where I think a lot of injury prevention happens. So let me give you an example. Someone comes out of a jump and they land and they don't land perfectly, right? Their blade doesn't hit perfectly on the ground. Now, all of a sudden their knee is pushed into valgus, which means their knee dips inward, right? So it looks like this. If my knee dips in, it's going to dip like that. Now, what do I want? I want general strength in the outside of my hip. I want general stability out there so that I can correct that so that my knee doesn't slam in and I don't tear my ACL. I want core stability. I want general core stability. So the ability to resist flexion and extension and side bending. I want the ability for my body to resist movement just as much as I want it to be able to produce movement. And that is, in my mind, the key to injury prevention is we have to start general and build specific. If we go right to specific, then we start to shortcut all of these big things and we're not actually getting a lot of the good benefits that we can easily get through through just being a little bit more general. So I think the specificity often comes in the training session. So like if I were to break it down, I would say there's a strength side and then there's the technical side. So if I'm working on getting a person to be more flexible, that might not be a strength session. That might be more a technique session.
Mm-hmm.
So, but there's lots of, and you'll probably know too, there's lots of different viewpoints on this stuff. I just always think my viewpoint's the best.
Yeah. So would a good analogy be this? No matter like what sport you're going to do, whether it's swim, bike, run, triathlon, figure skating, mountain biking, whatever it is, strength training, it serves a few purposes. First and foremost, maybe gives your body a really good foundation. So let's use the analogy of a house. Like if you build a house really well, the first thing you do is pour a concrete foundation.
Absolutely.
You level the ground, you pour a concrete foundation. So in one way, strength training serves to create that foundation. And from that foundation, so this is like general strength, just like what you said. It doesn't need to be sport specific yet. It's just a foundation so that no matter what direction I go in, the foundation or the platform, which is my body, is able to do any number of things. And then as we fill in the house, as we build it up and put in the details that we want, that's the more sport specific part of it. And as you said, what I liked what you said is there's really no substitute for the sport itself. So even if you can go to the gym all you want and try and do sport specific strength movements, but nothing is really going to be as effective as actually going and riding your bike or skating, going to the rink and skating. But
Absolutely.
if we have that foundation, it raises the bar of what's possible because we're not shaky.
I think that was very well put. And I always like to think of it like we are not trying to turn strength training into your sport. We're trying to add strength training to your sport. Mm-hmm. So, if I've seen trust me, over the years, I've seen everything. I've seen people go to the gym and squat with like their SPD shoes just to see what it would feel like to, push down with like the carbon platform and everything. I've seen coaches do some interesting things right after like a really hard strength training session. They go and get them to do, something very sport specific. There's lots of, in the field, there's lots of experimentation. People experiment a lot. And the hard thing to kind of, to take apart from this is we actually see like through, whether it's like through an Instagram or Facebook or something, we see what a lot of these really high level athletes do. And then we assume that we need to be doing it as well. Right. So we'll take take like some of the best athletes in the world, it's the best sprinters, best runners, triathletes, whatever it is. And we can actually see, or like go no further than like, Men's Health magazine, where like Hugh Jackman gets jacked for this movie doing this. And like, so we're all like, oh, this is what this person's doing because I also want to look like this guy. Let me do the exact same workout. It's funny because usually that's not really what they're doing. And then it's also that person has had a completely different life experience than you. So they might be doing very specific stuff when really they've already set this really general foundation. So I love the analogy you used. I also use the analogy of like, you first need to learn the alphabet, then you learn how to write words, then it's sentences. And then next thing you know, you're building onto these really beautiful, essays and paragraphs, and it just all flows afterwards. But if you don't know your vowels, if you don't know a few letters, you're going to have these deficits. That's, I think, when the injuries start to come a little bit more quickly, because there's big gaps in your vocabulary. So I love the house analogy too, right? You'd never really set a foundation that was crooked or unbalanced. And really that's part of what strength training is here for, is to help us balance ourselves so that we can perform more when we're doing our training sessions. It's kind of that ultimate foundation for us.
Yeah. Now I don't know if I don't want to get in the way of you just continue on your talk, but I've just got all these questions piling up in my brain.
Let me have them. I do way better with questions than just when I talk.
Yeah. So, well, given that we have a couple of young athletes on the session today, my question, and I don't know if you have a definite answer for this, is what age is too young to start? Now, I've heard different things. I was a downhill skier, and strength training is a really big part of that. but they were pretty cautious about starting us with really heavy load before our bodies had fully grown. So I do remember starting like weight training when I was about 14 or 15, but we only really got into really heavy loading, probably when I was like 15, 16. Like there was sort of this time in the probably 12 to 14-year-old window, 10 to 12. What age for her would you recommend that she can actually start, strength training? Or you answer that if you have an answer.
Yeah, so it's perfect because I was just a couple of years ago, I was at an orthopedics conference, and one of the people speaking was she specialized in uh, kind of the resolution after a person's had what's called a Salter-Harris fracture. Salter-Harris fracture is when a bone breaks right down the tip of the bone where the growth plates are. And so there's a whole bunch of different flavors, and depending on where it breaks through, that's the big concern that people have when it comes to weight training at a young age, is this impact on the growth plate, because our bones actually grow outwards, right? And so if you have damage there, then you could potentially stunt a person's growth. Now, what she was saying, and what I actually believe too, is that the body actually is very good at regulating. Like I said, it's that connection between what the needs are and what the body's willing to put out. A lot of that stuff is like there's very, very, very little research on why it is that we do that. It's basically based on theory. So someone thought, oh, we shouldn't have these young kids weight training right now because they'll stunt their growth plates because they're a vulnerable spot.
That's the what was used for us. You'll stunt your growth. And
Yeah.
I
So
didn't need any more of that.
imagine, can you only imagine? There's like take a look at uh, you know, China, or well, China's probably not a great example because the general population is relatively short, but there's not these incredibly tiny weightlifters, like they're average height, and Poland and Yugoslavia, all these places where people are lifting weights at a young age. Now, that being said, I think that when you're young, we don't have the best motor control right away. Some people do, some people don't. We all kind of like become more connected with our bodies as we get older, as we develop more neurologically. So I don't necessarily think that you need to be going out and maxing out when you're really young and doing as hard and heavy as you can. But I think that a person training like with weights can be a lot younger than we probably think. So I wish there was like a perfect age, and I'll kind of like leave it as a kind of it depends answer. But I think that if you're being, first of all, being supervised by somebody to make sure that you're not doing something that's going to be dangerous, because just like, even though the weight room is like one of the most controlled areas that we can have, stuff can still go wrong. Particularly, things tend to go wrong when we're picking up, like when we first initiate or when we finish movements. So think about like racking your weights and then taking your weights away, right? That's when like some injuries happen that are totally avoidable, right? Like you pull the weights off the squat rack and they come out uneven, and then you wobble and then you drop your weights on your foot or something. Like that's a totally avoidable injury if there's someone there helping you out. So I think when the first thing would be, start with body weight, get really comfortable training general movement patterns like squats, lunges, overhead work. So that could even be like overhead reaches, or it could be like hand to ground work. So like pushes and presses and pulls and all that kind of stuff. And then slowly start to add in more and more as you feel more and more comfortable with it. And always working with a good coach like that, again, like I said, is really helpful. The real problems happen when a person has no instruction and they're doing something new for the first time. Like I wouldn't go and try and learn how to play piano just by myself. I mean, maybe I could pull up a YouTube video, but I might pick up a few dirty habits while I'm doing it too. So sometimes it's good to actually get some instruction on that, and obviously supervision too. There's actually, most weight rooms have a rule where like if you're under the age of 14 or under the age of 16, you have to have like someone accompanying you. And that's just because, at that time, I don't know about you, but I made some weird decisions when I was 16. I didn't always choose the safe way.
Yeah.
So, but I'd say that, there's lots of people that start their strength training when they're like, even to get ready for a career in like Olympic weightlifting. Like I know Polish lifters are doing work with a dowel when they're like 8 and 10 years old.
Yeah. I was going
And
to
same,
say, for those who don't, a dowel is just like it looks like a weightlifting bar, but it's made out of wood. it's very light. So
Yeah.
maybe like, and so to further on that, like just making sure technically you really are proficient is probably one of the best places to start if you're young. Yeah.
Yeah, technical proficiency is really the key, and as you start to get better and better and more comfortable getting into those repetitions and knowing that what your movement is actually safe, that's when we can start adding weight to it. So it's like the same thing for me in my practice. If I saw a person do a body weight squat and I wasn't happy with it or I didn't think it was safe, there's no way I would put a barbell on them.
Right.
So proficiency comes first, and then you start to add load and then repetitions and things like that.
So on the same thread, we've talked about, you know, the young end of the spectrum. We also have Andy, who's 155 years old, and he's at the other end of the spectrum. I'm kidding. Andy's not. He's younger than that. um, but you know, what would your advice be to, you know, somebody who's a little bit older? I fit into that category now, in terms of strength training still being, you know, part of your activity, your life, even if you're not sort of striving towards high performance sport, you know, just as a general health thing.
Yeah, I think it's, well, so important for people as they get older to maintain muscle mass too, right? One of the biggest indicators for longevity is going to be how much muscle mass you have. And that doesn't mean that you have to bulk up, but it definitely wouldn't hurt. In fact, when you get past the age of 50, hormonally, it's way more tough for you to take on any muscle mass. So in a lot of ways, you could probably you could probably have more in your diet. Recovery becomes a huge part of that, because as we get a little bit older, our recovery needs to be taken more into account because it's just a lot more difficult for us to bounce back. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
and that we'll keep going if you want. Otherwise, I got another one stacking up in my
Oh,
head.
yeah, sure. No, and I was just going to say too, the most like general strength, I don't think it ever becomes not important, but it becomes very important when you're starting and kind of like, and when you're kind of getting towards like your retirement years too, because a lot of the time people shift their focus, right? They've been sitting at a desk or they've been working a job. They retire, now their body's opened up to all these different possibilities, right? They can take up a new sport, they could play golf more often, right? The amount of times where people retire, do something completely outside of their wheelhouse and they hurt themselves, it happens all the time. It's because we're literally, our bodies are so well adapted to what we've done for the last 30 years of our life, and now all of a sudden we go and we're trying to do something else. That's when I think strength training really shines, is because it can not only be a really good lens to look at the body through, so it can let us know what our weaknesses and strengths are, but it can also help to round us out a little bit more so that we can do more of that stuff that we want to. We should have more options with our body as we get older. We shouldn't be more limited.
So with that, I've got two questions. The first is, we often associate strength training almost entirely with muscle, you know, force production or muscle gain or recruitment. What about bone? I mean, the strength training for your bones is arguably as, if not more important, especially as we age. Yes.
That's where I was going to go with that too, because the thing is the association with lost muscle mass. As we get older, the biggest things that we're concerned about: bone density, balance, muscle mass. And so think about what that could potentially, the potentials there is like, if you start to lose your balance and you're not as strong as you possibly can be. Because again, right, every time we strength train, we're not just working on muscles, we're also working on coordination. We're working on our ability to like perceive our body and move it, right? There's not a lot of times where we're actually sitting and consciously thinking about how our quads or how our hips or how our glutes are working. So the more time that we're actually mindful of the way that we're moving, whether it be in like yoga class or a strength class or something like that, the more of that connection that we're going to have. So that improves our balance, our coordination, and it actually, like you said, densifies our bones, right? Like weight bearing activity when we're in our later years is super important, because just like our muscles adapt by getting stronger when we put strength in and load into it, our joints and our muscles do too. So if we are unweighted and we're sitting like this all the time, we're not actually putting a lot of stress into our feet, into our knees, into our hips. And the same way that you wouldn't program a person who's a newbie to just go and run 100-mile week, you'd wait and you'd build that up over time, right? You might start with 20-mile week, and then it might be 30, and then you might go up quicker, right? So the adaptation that happens in our bones is very similar to what happens in our muscles. It just takes a little bit more time for that adaptation to occur.
Okay, so next question, because again, they're just stacking up in my brain. And anybody else who wants to jump in, please do. But my next question is, okay, so one thing we get, especially with endurance athletes, but I'll pose this for our speed power athletes. I consider Tendo as basically a speed power athlete. It's actually a very unique sport in that their programs are 3 to 5 minutes in length. So they have to have the aerobic fitness of like a 1,500-meter runner, but then they also have to be able to jump up in the air and do very explosive movements within that. So, her sport's quite different. But anyway, regardless, number of times per week to actually, do what you need to do. So how many times per week is too little, too much? And what do you feel is like the recovery time needed between, a good strength training session?
Yeah, it's a good question too. And often it'll depend on what the person's doing for the rest of their training too. So if the focus is more in towards like that off season time, maybe you can get away with more strength sessions. It really depends on how much you deplete the body as well. And so my philosophy has changed a lot. I used to think it would be more about getting really good, well packed in sessions and then giving yourself like a day or two of rest and then doing another session right away. But I'm realizing that everybody recovers just a little bit differently. And so there's lots of different metrics we can use. Like if you're a very high performer, you can use like heart rate variability, which is a metric that lets you know how well you recover, like not just muscularly, but also neurologically. So heart rate variability is like a little indication of how quickly each of your heartbeats change. So think of it as how quickly and how easy it is for your body to fine tune the heart rate. Do you know much about that, Jasper?
Yeah, I actually use heart rate variability, well, on and off. I used it on myself for probably about 6 months just to explore it and see, what it did. And I haven't, like, I care less about myself at the moment, which is probably not the right thing to say, but yeah, I'm familiar with it. Used it a little bit. So
yeah, it's one tool that you can use, and like I've also experimented with it too, and it is pretty. You can definitely see there's some workouts where it's very, very high output, and you might not be tired afterwards, and the next day you're tanked, and you're just like, whoa, that was crazy. So that's one way of doing it, but it's a very technical way, right? Another way is to just realize like there's no perfect like. It's funny that we use 7 days a week for training, right? That's always been something that's blown me away. It's like, why do we do that 7 days a week? It's just because there are these built-in weekends, really. So we can be a little bit more. It's more easy on the mind, and it's easy on our schedule. But really, most of us should probably be training on like a 10-day block or like a 9-day block or something.
mhm.
I was like pretty fortunate to do some of my own coaching as well as seeing some other, like some of my coaches have gone on to do like unbelievable, like be, a lot more successful. And a lot of the stuff that they would give me was quite different. And some of it worked really well for me and some of it didn't. So even like a great coach can give a program to a person and it doesn't necessarily have to be, it's not going to work great for them. So I think there's a level of self-experimentation and also a lot of feedback that goes into that. So for instance, if a person's doing 4 sessions a week, let's say they do a um, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then they do like one of the on the weekends, and that's too much. Well, they're going to start to know because their performance is going to start to decrease a little bit. And so fine tuning that to maybe 3 days a week or sometimes even 2 days a week is all good as well. So I would say that the average person definitely needs to do more than one a week. That's one thing. Like these are the things that I know for sure. One time a week of training is just enough to feel like crap and then not nearly good enough to get those long-term results. So like if you're going to like one class a week and you beat yourself up and you feel stiff and sore and then you go back and then now Sunday's rolled around and you're like, oh, I actually feel pretty good again, and you throw yourself right back into the ringer. Those, like every stress that we give ourselves, our body has to recover from too. But ideally what we do is we link these little recoveries together so that we can get ourselves further and further across. It's just it's like a dosage of a medication, right? Too much is going to be too little, too much is going to be too much. And what we really want to hit is that perfect wave so that we get this nice rippling effect.
Usually,
So
I mean, one of the challenges that we have, especially in endurance sport, is just the time factor. You know, like
yeah,
most of the people we work with are, you know, working families. This is like their recreation, their fun, and they have 10, 15 hours a week to dedicate to it. And so it's like, where do we fit that in? And usually it kind of comes out around 2 a week. One a week I've never thought is going to really do anything for you. Just as you said, like it's not enough to do anything. It just makes you feel smashed every time.
yeah.
And so 2 usually is where we end up, just out of, you know, hours that they have available to them. So
One other thing too that I should mention is that, so anybody at a very high level that I train, I don't want them to hardly ever leave the gym feeling smashed.
mm,
So, and the reason is because human beings, we're so good at pushing past our limits. And so really a lot of these gym sessions, if you're doing them right, you should leave feeling like you've got some reps in the tank. Like you should, I mean, there's maybe 1 or 2 times a year where you want to leave the gym feeling beat up. But if you're feeling completely, sore and like, oh man, like I'm going to be really beat up tomorrow, you're just kind of, you're digging into your reserves. Like, so there's that point of diminishing return, right? So this is actually probably a good thing to quickly discuss too, is this idea of your minimal effective dose and then your maximum recoverable volume. So I know that sounds like a mouthful, but I'll try and explain it here and make it seem a little bit easier. So the minimum effective dose, just like Jasper was saying, if you do 1 day a week, that's probably going to be too low for your body to actually notice anything aside from maybe some muscle soreness, and maybe are getting, I'm not going to totally dismiss it because you might be getting some, balance help, and there might be a few things that you're getting, but on the grand scheme, it's not a lot. Now, if we do 3 sessions a week, for one person, that could be perfect. 3 sessions a week is going to give that person just the right stimulus that their body can recover from it. So the next week they can bounce back and they can train a little bit harder and they can train a little bit more. Now, if I give that person 4 sessions a week, that first 3 sessions are going to be enough to kind of dig them into a bit of a hole. But when I squeeze that extra session in, they're not able to recover for it. They're actually going to dig themselves even deeper. And now when that next week rolls around, when they go to get that recovery cycle, they're not going to catch that full recovery. They're only going to be like 70 or 60 or 50% recovered. So now we're digging ourselves into this deficit. We're digging ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper. And to do that for a short period of time can be okay. But if we do that long term and we're not monitoring it, that can be where a person starts to develop injuries and problems and things like that. So what I really think though is that we're so good at pushing past our limits. We're constantly hitting that over fatigue area. And if we were to thinking of it as more of like finding out what that maximum recoverable volume is, we would be shocked to see that it's actually a lot earlier than what we can push ourselves to. So I actually encourage a lot of people, especially when they're first learning how to lift, don't go to the point where you feel like you push yourself. Go to about 80%. And when I say 80%, it's not 80% effort, 80% volume, right? So I might get a person to do a really heavy, like 3 or 4 sets of 3 for squats. But if I start to feel, or if I start to notice that their performance is dipping towards the end, even though they can grind it out, they stop right away. Jasper, do you know who Donald Chu is?
Yeah, I recognize the name, but yeah.
Yeah, he's super well known for plyometrics. Like he's like the godfather of plyometrics. Like I think he wrote the very first ever book in the US about plyometrics in like 1993 or 1994, like super early adopter to plyometrics. And he had such great success with his all the track and field guys in California. I think he was at UC Berkeley or something. And I remember reading his book super early when I was in UVic, and I remember being confused because he would talk about, he'd shut these workouts down for people if he saw them they weren't performing. So plyometrics are a perfect example, because plyometrics are supposed to be explosive. That's the kind of stuff that our speed skaters and figure skaters are going to do, right? They have to be fit, but then they also have to be really explosive. So they coil and explode throughout the connective tissue, right? Plyometrics, if you do a plyometric and you do 100 of them, you're not doing a plyometric anymore. Now you're doing body weight endurance strength. A plyometric is designed to be maximum explosive power, right? So if we take that same philosophy into the gym, I want you to look at things as, if you start to see this decrease, if you all of a sudden are grinding through these movements, you're not really actually getting the effect that you want anymore. So I would rather you stop, break that set into a bunch of different smaller sets, so that you can recover in between and you can hit all of those efforts with good ease, right?
Yeah.
And there's a time and place for all of this stuff too. It's just like talking about whether or not you're going to do long, steady distance or you're going to do intervals. So strength training is, I mean, maybe the take home from this is, strength training is a lot more than just 3 sets of 10. It's a lot more than just bodybuilding and stuff. There's a lot that goes into it. Yeah. But I also think that there's a lot that's left on the table for people that are just kind of doing like a basic strength program. Because if you think about it, if it's an hour of your week, or if it's 2 hours of your week, that is a huge potential of time where you could get a lot of benefit out of such a short period of time. So that's why I'm so passionate about teaching this stuff to people, is because I wish I knew a lot more of this stuff when I was younger, when I was cycling, because it would have saved me a lot, but it also is like a huge performance enhancer for a lot of people.
Yeah, I definitely have, like, all through my racing, I was a big advocate of strength training, and anytime that I omitted it from my program for whatever reason, never had the same success. And it wasn't just mental, like it really was a thing.
Oh yeah. And like for a while, there's lots of people that would be like, oh, don't, like, strength training is like just taking away from, well, maybe I will say this too. It's like, if you're treating your strength training like a really hard training session, and you're just trying to like fatigue yourself like crazy, I think that actually is detrimental. That starts to take away from your training session the next day. You want to be fresh. You want to have enough time. And I guess maybe this falls into the question you had too, Jasper, about like what sessions, how many sessions should you have? I think the priority is always going to be making sure that your technical sessions are able to be performed with enough freshness that they're not being compromised. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing technique work and your body's too bagged from your strength session, you either need to space those sessions out more, or you need to cut that strength sessions short and realize that, like, technique for some people, so technique for a figure skater is going to be way more important than that strength, right? Like, I'm sure you'd be better off nailing a triple axel than like fumbling on a quadruple, right? Mm-hmm. So you'd be better off, and then eventually over years you get better and better. But I think the technical side is always going to be really important, because at the end of the day, nothing replicates that playing surface or that competition surface, right?
Right. Yeah.
You had some good questions.
Well, you know what? I've got lots more. I do have to wrap it up here. Well, just in the interest of everybody's time. Yeah, no, as I said, I could chat with you about this for hours. I've got questions about plyometrics
dude, call me up anytime you want.
Yeah, well, let's do it again.
It's just me and Gordo here.
Yeah, let's get you on again, or we'll do a podcast where we can maybe expand a little bit more.
Yeah, man, I'd love to. So it's always fun. Like I said, this is fun for me because I just love it.
Yeah. Well, you're clearly very passionate about it and very knowledgeable. And I don't, we have a few people. I don't want to. If somebody does have a question, jump in. Otherwise, I am going to wrap it up just in the interest of time. Tendo, do you have a question? No.
I was a psycho, the ultimate psycho there.
Anybody else? Thomas? Good? Thomas just absorbs everything. He's got it. Andy, you good?
Hi, Alicia. Hi. Thanks, Dan. That was awesome.
Alicia's had her camera off because she's been pumping iron while you're. She's got her own gym. No, this has been awesome. Dan, thank you so much. You're always so gracious and generous with your time. And yeah, really, really appreciate it. And if anybody has follow-up questions after, definitely feel free to email me and we can kind of get to the bottom of stuff. But that was just awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it. You guys are always, it's always an honor being asked to come on here. So thanks so much.
Well, we got lots more scheduled for the fall, and we'd love to get you on again. Tendo's just sending you a note in the chat saying thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you. I appreciate. It's nice to have a nice variety of athletes in here too. So
yeah, it's cool. Tendo's come to a couple, and I'm glad she is because she's sort of a sponge for learning and a heck of an athlete. So hopefully this was valuable. And to you too, Thomas, who's got a 30-something K run coming up soon, I think. I can't remember the distance. 26. What is it? 26. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. And then Andy's just like, Andy's like an old schooler, did Hawaii Ironman back in the 80s. And
oh yeah.
Now he's a very active, fit dude. So
sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Jazz. Yeah. So thanks, Dan. That was awesome. I'm 63 now, so I'm really interested in the muscle mass, the bone density, and what I've noticed lately is balance. So really enjoyed the session.
It's I think balance is so key too. Like honestly, even you'd be shocked at how quickly something like that can disappear, but you'd be really shocked at how quickly you can get it back too.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. And what's the secret? You to the longevity because you look like you're about 35.
I'm a $135. I don't know, just kind of I'm ADD with kind of things I like to do, and swim, run, bike, played hockey, backpack, ultra running. I'm pretty much like to be able to be in a place where I'm fit enough to go do most things. Might not do them all that well, but feel I have a base that I can go try anything. But this aging thing is really interesting as to I have to start doing some other things so that I can continue to do this into my 70s.
That's the dream. I feel like you're living it. I was just talking with a patient yesterday, and it's funny because a lot of the time we're very activity driven. Like we just want to do activities. And sometimes that's like being very food driven, and we need to supplement every once in a while. We might not be getting a totally balanced diet. So sometimes it's good to take a few supplements in there, right? That's kind of the same strength training analogy, right? So that could be like balance. It could be a little bit of strength. So I'm glad you got something out of the talk.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Dan, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who joined. And if anybody might be interested, this always ends up on our YouTube, but in a little bit. So cool.
Okay.
Thanks you guys.
Have a good one.
See ya.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Dan.
See you guys.
Okay. See ya.